Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this very short address. I must say this morning's session I thought was absolutely fascinating. Anwar Ibrahim is an old friend of mine from 30 years ago. It was a delight to see him and listen to his very intelligent and wise argument about the way the world is going. I'm afraid you're now stuck with the post-lunch session where I shall talk to you about a moderately dull subject of reputation management. First of all, let me try and put my remarks in a context. I actually started in the communications industry the moment I was born and opened my mouth. I then discovered that I could do it for a living and get paid for it, so I went into the communications business. For the first 25 years, I've actually done 5 decades, James, rather than 4. For the first 2.5 of those, I worked in the advertising industry. And I spent, for those of you who are concerned about the ethics and morals of the communications business, as indeed the gentleman from Aramco seemed to be somewhat concerned about it, I spent 25 years being told that what the advertising industry was tell lies about products, make people buy things they didn't want, destroy the landscape by putting up appalling advertisements that spoiled the beauty of the scenery, and generally destroy the whole of society by making it obsessed with consumerism. I then moved from that, having decided that was fine, and I moved into the public relations industry, where I've spent my life being told that I spend my time making people who are bad look good. I was privileged to be described as the original spin doctor, which is absolute rubbish, but I did work for the then chairman of the British Coal Board during the miners' strike in the 80s, which was one of the most violent strikes that ever took place in Britain. And he had a very deep American voice. His name was McGregor, and he was known as Big Mac everywhere. And he used to call me Dr. Bell all the time. I asked him why once. Dr. Bellini really is a doctor. I'm not, but he said I was a spin doctor, so I accepted that as a title. I've got very little time to talk to you about the challenges and opportunities of public relations at the age of dialogue, but I'll do what I can. Lest I mislead you in what I say, let me make it clear that I believe profoundly in freedom of speech and expression and in a free market of information, even if I am troubled by the frequent abuse of that freedom and the distortion of freedom that regulation causes. I believe, very simply, that people want to live in a civil society. And what a civil society is made up of is that people should act with restraint, that they should act with honor, and that they should be aware of the difference between right and wrong. And that's a very simple life credo, which is very easy to follow. It doesn't require you to get into a debate about the code of conduct of the public relations industry, or the code of conduct of corporate communicators, or the code of conduct of advertising men. Because if you believe in those things, then you're going to apply the principles of restraint and honor and right and wrong to all the things that you do. Let me start by just questioning, first of all, the premise of this session, which is the age of dialogue. I looked up the word dialogue in the Oxford English Dictionary, and it says this: a discussion intended to explore a subject or solve a problem. And of a monologue, it says a long, boring speech by one person. I sincerely hope I don't fall into that trap. Clement Freud, who was the grandson of Sigmund Freud, used to begin his speeches in Britain by saying, "This speech is so boring, please turn on your mobile phones." You're supposed to laugh at that. Thank you. Makes me feel better. It may not make you feel better, but it makes me feel better. I think it's quite difficult to believe that we are in an age of dialogue when you look at the way that so-called dialogue takes place. If you look at the modern creations of the last 20 years of the internet, like Google and Wikipedia, and for that matter, the internet in general, plus the continued use of state-owned media, state-sponsored advertising, and the techniques that are used by the protest movements, whether for or against the status quo, one sees not a dialogue, but a heated argument, where the loudest and richest, or most numerous, or best resourced tend to win the day, and if they don't win, then the most tragic or the most appealing win. I don't think they win through weight of argument, they win through volume of noise. Were there real dialogue, as in a genuine listening and learning exercise, and not just a one-sided shouting, then maybe what we've seen happen in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya, in Syria, and now Russia, not to mention the student protests in London or the anti-capitalist movement across the West, we might actually have seen some discussion and people might have acquired some knowledge. But I think not. Equally, it raises the issue of the effectiveness of bodies like the United Nations, the Arab League, the African and the European Unions, and most democratically elected parliaments. You don't have one here. I come from one, I sit in one. And I can assure you that there is no dialogue whatsoever. What actually happens is people stand up and say one thing, and a guy on the other side stands up and says the opposite. Then a guy on your side stands up and says what you just said slightly differently. And the guy on the other side stands up and says what the other man just said slightly differently. And then we all go and vote, exactly as we intended to vote in the first place. None of it influenced by any of the argument that goes on. And in fact, the upper house, of which I'm a member, is now so effective at slowing down legislation and making people think again that we're going to be abolished and replaced by another bunch of elected politicians who are so ineffectual in the House of Commons that they achieve absolutely nothing, and so we'll have two houses that achieve absolutely nothing. I was quite fascinated, actually. I saw a letter from an American senator who said he didn't understand why the British were so worried about electing the House of Lords. After all, they'd had an elected House of Representatives and an elected Senate for years and years, and that had never caused any problem whatsoever. I think if you were to ask the various presidents of the United States over the last 50 years, they might have had a slightly different view about it. And of course, he misses the point that the administration of America is not elected, only the president. Most of the people who serve in the administration are appointed. The problem is that if the debate and the dialogue doesn't work, then we tend to fall back on all the old methods that have been used for years and years. And I think the fact that NATO was deployed in Libya is proof that at the very highest level, dialogue has failed and the gun prevails. Similarly, in Iraq and Afghanistan, where I fear not even the gun can prevail. But the role of international mediation and conflict resolution is perhaps not for me to debate, particularly since it's already been discussed this morning. So let me discuss a slightly different aspect of it, which is what I believe is true, that there is a general desire for a peaceful world, which is now more under threat than ever. Has it been enhanced by the information age? I don't think it has. I think it's been made worse. I happen to believe in free trade. I believe in freedom of movement. And I actually believe in the tolerance of choice other than one's own. And they are the keys to a peaceful world. And I don't want to get into a debate of whether my tolerance is better than your tolerance or somebody else's tolerance. It just seems to me that tolerance is a virtue. I actually think that what we should do is live and let live. It might be a useful credo. And you might support it by a belief in a world where all may grow strong, but none at the expense of each other. The truth is that all these arguments, all these debates, whether they be about religions or about political movements or political ideologies, we are left with three problems that have messed up this world ever since time immemorial. One is that there is a gap between the rich and the poor. That gap will be there forever. It will grow bigger. It will grow smaller. It will never disappear. I can safely predict that. The second is that we have too many people chasing too few jobs. So we have an enormous economic problem of people not having work and not having any wages. And then the third difficulty that we have is the fact that we naturally form into groups and then start to compete with each other. I was trying to understand the economic impact of what you might call tribalism or divisions in society, whether you're a Manchester United supporter or a Manchester City supporter, if I can mention that here, doesn't seem to make people able to get on with each other very well. And because it has a huge impact on our economic life. I remember Mayor Yuri Lushkov, who was the mayor of Moscow for many years, who set up a political party to compete against Putin in the first of Putin's election victories. And he said that he wanted me to understand the economic philosophy of Russia. And I said, please tell me. And he said, well, there's this chap living in a village in the center of Russia, and he's a farmer, and he has a cow. And the cow is a fantastically productive, healthy cow. And it produces all the milk and the cream and the yogurt and the butter and the cheese that the village wants. And one day the mayor of the village called him in and said, Yuri, your cow is very successful, and produces all the butter and the cream and the cheese and the milk that the village wants. But I think it's time for the village to grow. So why don't you buy a second cow? And the farmer replied, better my neighbour's cow dies. And that perhaps is one of the reasons why the commercial activities that we in the communications and marketing world do are sometimes seen as being destructive, because we spend so much of our time trying to knock the other man down rather than by just simply building our business. But the reality is that we live in the age of information. We have what people originally called the superhighway, the internet. Sadly, although it is the age of information, it is not an age of wisdom. Because the problem is that too much of the dialogue goes astray or is not heard by the right audience. At present, we're seeing uprisings all over the world, protests everywhere. Don't get me wrong, I believe in the right to protest, but that doesn't follow that all protests are right. The government, or those in authority, use traditional methods of communication, state television, radio, and newspapers. The opposition, it appears, use Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And now the governments are starting to use Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. God knows what's going to happen when everybody's whole life contains 140 characters written on Twitter. Where will the books on philosophy be? Where will the lectures on ideology be? Perfect examples of the power of this can be seen during the Iranian elections in 2009, and of course the uprising in Egypt and Tunisia, and now the subjugation of Homs in Syria. But in both cases, all cases, both sets of protagonists were telling the outside world what was happening. Their version of events, of course. But what they are not doing is communicating with each other. They're not having a dialogue. They are rather calling on the court of public opinion to support their cause, and in particular, courting media opinion as an icon of public opinion. And that's really where the public relations industry starts to come into the picture, because we as a trade have spent our life involved in media relations, in persuading the media, the third party, to endorse, inform, and encourage people to buy products, or to accept views, or to adopt attitudes, or to change behavior. And so inevitably we get called into these disputes to work for one side or the other. I remember an advertisement for Barclaycard some years ago in which Rowan Atkinson, who you may know as Mr. Bean, is bartering with a Tuareg tribesman to buy a carpet, but he's getting nowhere. Nonetheless, his sidekick in the advertisement is in awe and states he had no idea that Atkinson was fluent in Tuareg. He is wrong, of course, for Atkinson replies, "We are both fluent, but sadly in different languages." What is needed is some clarity to be brought to the situation, and that's where the public relations industry is often invaluable, because its whole purpose is to make propositions compelling, to make them easy to understand, to make them imaginative, and to capture the public's imagination. And so the answer to the first part of the debate this afternoon, can public relations companies foster dialogue and understanding? The answer is yes, they can, and yes, we do, but it's not always easy. Let me give you an example. In March 2008, I found myself in a city called Minsk, which is the capital of Belarus. Its leader, President Lukashenko, is known as the last dictator of Europe, and the country itself was pretty much isolated from the West by economic and trade and political sanctions. You have to understand that the powers that be think that if somebody is doing something wrong, the best thing to do is ignore them and not speak to them, as though somehow or other that will persuade them to do the right thing. I was there because I'd been asked to go and see the president, because he said that he wanted to reposition Belarus so that it was viewed more favorably by the West. I sat in front of the president and explained to him that in order to be credible, we needed tangible and very real positive movement by his government to demonstrate a genuine willingness to change. He said to me, "I want to go down the road to a better democracy." Now, the reason I asked for that reassurance is simple. Good public relations needs substance. We cannot create something out of nothing. Reputation is about what you do as well as what you say. There is a big difference between public relations and propaganda. The president assured me he was genuine in his intentions and that he would do what had to be done. So it was that in June 2008, my company, Pottinger, started a year-long contract working with the government of Belarus. In the year that followed, we managed to get the top 3 political prisoners out of prison. The parliamentary elections, whilst far from perfect, were judged to be slightly better than the previous ones. The European Union dropped permanent travel sanctions and put them on a 6-monthly review. The children who'd been affected by Chernobyl, the nuclear explosion, were allowed to travel to Europe for respite. Inward investment was boosted, and even tourism was greatly improved. Was it a success for Belarus? Undeniably, the answer is yes. Was it a success for Pottinger? The answer would be the same. But if you asked me specifically, was it a success for the reputation of Pottinger, my answer would be more cautious. Pottinger was vilified in the press for working with Belarus. I was personally abused on every occasion that people could do so. No attempt was made to discover our remit, what we achieved, or how we conducted ourselves, lest it detracted from the sensationalist headlines and prejudice that people already held. The result was that we were branded as toxic and immoral. Was it justified? Not at all. An old adage comes to my mind: never let the facts get in the way of a good story. Incidentally, as a postscript, Belarus reneged on its promises, we terminated the contract, and the sanctions were reinstated. The truth is, however, even though I tell that story against myself, that rehabilitation is good. It's morally sound. It's ethically fine. And there is nothing wrong with helping people who have been behaving badly to try and behave well. We work for hundreds of clients every year. Inevitably, some of them are controversial. And of course, what we do for them, we deliberately make controversial. What is the point of making news if people pay no attention to it? David Ogilvy said in his first book about advertising, he told the story of a man walking down a farm lane, and there was a man in a field with his donkey, and he was hitting him on the head with a stick. And the chap ran up to him and said, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" He said, "I'm training my donkey." But he said, "You're hitting him on the head with a stick." He said, "Yes, I've got to get his attention first." Those of you in the media will recognize the power of a headline. If clients give assurances that they are ready to make the changes to their policies or behaviors, then we are ready to work with them in repairing their reputation. This applies to individuals, to companies, to governments, to movements, to whomsoever. And the reason we seek those reassurances is simple. A successful communication strategy cannot operate in a vacuum. It has to support and be supported by the right policy decisions. As I said before, reputation depends on what you do, not just on what you say. It's about building up trust. And this leads me to the second tenet of today's session. As far as I'm concerned, it's how well we conduct our business that matters. That's where we earn the trust we so desire. Earlier I said there was a big difference between public relations and propaganda, yet the dividing line between the two is very thin. Practice good public relations, no matter how difficult the circumstances or the remit, and you'll be okay. Practice propaganda, and you deserve what you get. I strongly believe that everybody has the right to representation. I strongly defend the right of my company or any other agency, for that matter, to represent any client. The fact remains that in taking on a client, good or bad, it is our reputations at stake, not theirs. I stress again, it is how well we do the job that will determine whether we are trusted or not. I do not believe that there is a lack of trust in our profession or trade, depending on how you like to judge it, but there is a lack of understanding. We do not do enough to dispel that lack of understanding. I suspect the reason for that is that we are agents and not principals. Is there a suspicion that we have undue influence? I am constantly accused of undue influence, and so is the industry. I defy any of you to defy what on earth undue influence means, because I can't understand what it means. If it's due influence, I understand, but undue influence, I'm not sure about. Are people's suspicions warranted? Of course not. For many reasons, clients or products want to remain confidential. We are often not able to explain what it is that we're doing or why we're doing it. We become the lightning rod for that mistrust. It is something we have to learn to live with. In the main, it's our duty to remain in the background, to live by the mantra, do not become the story. That makes us an easy target for the media. As you well know, anybody who doesn't want to be the story is who the media seeks out in order to make them the story. By working with one side, we will always be construed as being against the other. Does running a communication strategy for a multinational mining company in Africa mean that you are against the environment and against the local people? Of course not. Does working for a defense manufacturer mean that you condone violence and war? Of course it doesn't. But read some press stories and you would be forgiven for thinking that the public relations industry is totally lacking in conscience and morally vacuous. And sadly, you would think the same if you listened to some of the public relations practitioners. We are not, of course. This session and the panel discussion that we're about to have will centre on the general lack of trust and what we can do to remedy it. I hope somebody comes up with a solution because I can't think of one. Our clients and the messages we are trying to communicate are things that we do for our clients, and they certainly trust us. The dreaded third-party commentator is probably the one who spends as little time as possible trusting us. But then you can't please all of the people all of the time. Can we be loved by both, the public, our clients, and the media? Or are we caught between a rock and a hard place? The answer is yes and yes. But let me give you some hope. The world is going to end, but not yet. There will almost certainly be a nuclear war, but not yet. Google and the pocket computer will run your life, but only if you let it. Human ingenuity is alive and well. I suggest that you join the activists and not the passives. I have a mantra which I've always believed in every time I've been asked to talk about how the communications industry has changed because of some new technology, some new distribution method, some new idea that's come along. And that is to quote from the French, "Ça que change ne change plus." The fact is, a picture is still worth 1,000 words, possibly 2,000 now. A single-minded proposition that comes alive in a compelling way is still the best way to develop a proposition for your client. Televisual communication works better than any other form of communication there is, always has and always will. An idea that captures the imagination can change the world. And that is the most optimistic thing about life. One thing I can assure you is that our instinct to survive will get us past all the problems that people are creating. We won't produce perfect solutions, but we'll produce solutions that get us on. If you'd been living in Europe 6 months ago, you would have believed that the euro was coming to its end, that the eurozone was going to collapse. The democratically elected government in Greece and Italy were replaced by technocrat governments, and people started to see the end of democracy. Ironic, of course, that democracy should have started in Greece and should end in Greece. But it hasn't happened. The euro isn't dead. It's gone up this morning. The stock market is continuing to play the roulette wheel with extreme gambles that make it go up and up and up. And life is just beginning to return to economic growth. There'll be an election in America, and somebody will win it. Will it make much difference? I don't think so. It might make a 5% difference, but it won't make a 20% difference. Those days are over. They only come along about once every 30 or 40 years. I was privileged to work for Thatcher and for Reagan and to help FW de Klerk abolish apartheid in South Africa. Those were great, great moments. And one of the things that I learned out of that is that if you spend your life expecting other people to make it for you, you will have a miserable time. If you spend your life trying to make sure that you run your own life, that you do what's best for you, then you will probably have a good time. And I want to end by telling you a story. English people always have to tell jokes, as you probably know, so you have to laugh when I've told you this story. There's a story about a man walking along the cliffs at Dover. They're the white cliffs on the edge of England. They're nothing compared to the tower you've got here in terms of height. Incidentally, the tower is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. But much prettier than the Empire State Building. This man is walking along the cliff and he slips. And he falls off the cliff. And as he's falling to the ground below, he grabs hold of a branch. And he's hanging from the branch. And he looks down at the rocks and the surf and instant death below. And he looks up a sheer cliff wall, 500 feet. No chance of holding on to anything. And he calls out, "Is there anybody up there?" And a huge voice fills the sky. "My son, this is the voice of God. If you believe and have faith, let go of that branch, and you will float like a feather to the ground below." And the man looks down at the rocks and surf, and he looks up at the sheer cliff, and he says, "Is there anybody else up there?" The answer is there isn't. You can't live by a code of conduct. You can't live by being regulated by an institution. You have to run your own life, and you need to run it by your own standards. Thank you for listening.